Welcome everybody. Welcome to our Funding Environmental Outcomes on Your Farm for the West Coast. My name is Rhianna and I'll be introducing a couple of our people today. You guys as participants should be on mute, but should you have a question and answer or question at any time, at the bottom of your screen there should be a Q&A button. On that Q&A button you can click that and submit a question at any time. So submit that question anytime. We will specifically answer questions at certain times at various breaks, so please feel free to type the question whenever it pops in your head. The webinar is being recorded, so should you need to leave at any time or you think there's somebody who's interested who might want to check this out a little bit later, you're not able to attend or otherwise, the link to this will be made available. So without any further ado, again, my name is Rhianna Hughes Eddy. I am the New Zealand Landcare Trust West Coast Catchment Coordinator, and in that role, I am an independent resource with the goal of helping landowners and farmers look after their land and waterways by connecting them with others, facilitating best management practices, and in this instance, connecting you with funding. On the West Coast, in my role, I've noticed that funding is available. There are organizations who want to fund initiatives and innovation, but I totally understand it can be quite overwhelming to wade through. And so at no point can I assure any funding, but I can aim to bridge the gap between what funders want and what landowners need. So that's part of the goal of today, is to help bridge that gap a little bit. And so to start with, I would like to hand it over to Lauren. Lauren Long is a senior analyst with the Ministry for the Environment. She is a lead for the Freshwater Improvement Fund, and I'm really pleased that she's taken the time to discuss this and other funding with us today. I think it will be really valuable. And with that, Lauren, can I pass it over to you?
Yes, great. Yeah, so thanks, Rhianna, for inviting us to give a presentation on the Freshwater Improvement Fund. We're really happy to be able to do this. So as Rhianna said, my name is Lauren Long. I'm a senior analyst in the freshwater investments team at MFE, and we look after all of the freshwater community funding that the ministry invests in. So I've just got a short presentation, and I'll just bear with me while I just share my screen so we can go through that. Here we go. All right, so I'm going to be talking about the Freshwater Improvement Fund today. And the Freshwater Improvement Fund is a $100 million fund over 10 years to improve the management of freshwater. So we held the first round of the fund back in 2017, where $45 million of that was awarded to 33 projects. And just listed there are some of the key interventions. So we invested in riparian fencing. A lot of plants have been planted. We've retired land. At over 200 hectares of wetland habitat restored, 241 farm plans established, and over 100 hectares of pest control. So that's kind of a key snapshot. There's many other things as well. So most of the projects are still ongoing because they can be funded for up to 5 years. So I think there's only about 2 of the projects out of the 33 that have been finished. As part of the COVID-19 recovery package, we now have Jobs for Nature funding, which is nearly $1.3 billion over 4 years. And that was given to multiple government agencies to benefit the environment, people, and regions. And the purpose of the Jobs for Nature funding is to provide up to 11,000 jobs while ensuring environmental benefits. So it's about job creation as well as getting environmental benefit. And it's also about getting money and support as quickly as possible to communities. As part of this 1.3 billion, MFE received 433 million for projects to improve freshwater quality, and subsumed under Jobs for Nature now is the Freshwater Improvement Fund. So even though that was existing, that's now part of Jobs for Nature funding. So there's more of an emphasis on job creation through the fund. So we held round 2 of the Freshwater Improvement Fund in September, and it was the first round under the Jobs for Nature program. So the purpose of that funding round was we wanted to create employment opportunities which will improve the management of New Zealand's freshwater. So since 45 million was already allocated, we have 55 million left for rounds 2, and then we're also planning a round 3. So round 2 was announced relatively quickly, since one of the Jobs for Nature goals was to get money as soon as possible to the region. So round 2 focused on those shovel-ready projects, people that already had idea projects and could get things going on the ground pretty quickly. Whereas round 3 has now just opened, and that was to allow more time for people to plan projects. Once it was announced back in August or September, they have until January to plan a project for round 3. So the key investment areas for round 2 was the reduction of sediment eroding from land, wetland construction and restoration, stream reinstatements, estuary protection and restoration of fish passage. Again, so round 2, we just announced a couple of weeks ago that 36 million was awarded to 19 projects. And those are some of the key interventions that will hopefully come to fruition once all the projects enter into a deed of funding and those projects get off the ground. So along with those key interventions, some notable aspects of successful projects that would be useful for you to keep in mind is that all of them had very strong partnership scores, with more than half of them including iwi and hapu as partners. And the job creation is expected to generate 413 full-time equivalent jobs over the life of the projects. So as I just mentioned, we're now opened for round 3. So that opened last week, and we will be accepting expressions of interest for round 3 until noon on the 10th of February. So as for round 2, we have the same purpose for round 3, and that includes the same focus of funding, except for now there's a more explicit focus on job creation and building capacity and capability in freshwater management and restoration. This is just a general idea of the timeline. So the whole process is a bit indicative at the moment. So we need to see how we go, how many expressions of interest we receive, and the process from there before we can confirm dates. But as I mentioned, the funding round closes on midday on the 10th of February. And then we have an assessment panel that will assess all of the expressions of interest. So I don't know if anyone's had a chance to look at the expressions of interest form on our website, but it's relatively short. It's only about 4 pages of text. It's got text limitations. So it's really just about putting forward kind of your general ideas of projects. And of the successful expressions of interest, we will then invite you to submit a full application. So we expect that those applications will then be due in June, where the assessment panel will then come back and assess those applications and make funding recommendations to the sustainable land use ministers. So it's the ministers that make the ultimate decision on which projects get funded. This is just a quick look at the eligibility criteria. So in order to submit an expression of interest, you need to meet all of these things. So for the first one, the project must meet one or more of the following, and that's achieving demonstrable co-benefits. And that's things like increasing water quality, increasing biodiversity, habitat protection, soil conservation. So that's really about the environmental benefits. And then there's also about increasing capability and capacity in relation to freshwater management, establishing or enhancing collaborative management, increasing the application of Mātauranga Māori in freshwater management. And it can also include applied research component that contributes to improved understanding of the impacts of freshwater interventions. So you only need to meet one of those conditions to be eligible to apply. The minimum request for funding is $200,000. So this fund is really geared towards the bigger projects. It can be funded for a maximum of up to 5 years, and it must achieve benefits that would not otherwise be realized without the fund or not more appropriately funded through other sources. We're also expecting you to monitor, evaluate, and report the effectiveness of the project and the outcomes. And all projects will need to have an appropriate governance structure, but it doesn't have to be an existing governance structure. It can be part of your project to set one up once you get funded. And the applicant must also be a legal entity. So the purpose of being a legal entity is if you have, a whole group of people that have come together for a project, we just need to be able to contract with someone. So once we assess your application for whether, or your expression of interest for whether it is eligible for funding, we will then give it to the assessment panel, and the assessment panel will assess all EOIs against the assessment criteria and also by merit against each other. So there's 9 assessment criteria. So that's the proposed solution and likelihood of success, management of vulnerable water bodies, environmental benefits, employment benefits, COVID-19 recovery outcomes, public benefit, project costs and co-funding, partnerships and collaboration, and capability to successfully deliver the project. And those highlighted ones there are the ones that the assessment panel puts the most emphasis on when reviewing the expressions of interest. And just while we're talking about the assessment criteria, there's from round 2, there were a few things that seemed to kind of trip up the applicants. So I thought I'd just talk about those now. So one is that we expect that there to be 1 or more FTE per $100,000 of Freshwater Improvement Fund funding. So that's the kind of employment benefit that we're expecting. And we have also needed to find a way to standardize what an FTE means, because if someone employs 1 person for 6 months versus a couple of people over the whole 5 years, we need to find a way of managing to compare those 2 things against each other. So the FTE will be annualized and also cumulative. So if you're hiring 1 person for all 5 years of your project, that's actually 5 FTE if it's full-time. So if you have 2 people that you're hiring for 6 months, that's 1 FTE. So I hope that makes sense. I can answer some more questions around that if it doesn't. There's also another thing that seemed to trip people up and that we wanted some clarity on is around the COVID recovery and how you would target the unemployed or the underemployed in your region, and that would include working with MSD and training people to kind of redirect their career into the kind of environmental management and restoration, and also looking for a high level of partnerships. So there's a real focus on partnering with other community groups or iwi and hapu or the regional councils, whatever it might be within your region, because the more people that you're partnering with and the more buy-in that you have, the greater chance of success. So we really like to see that there's a lot of support for your project and that you're going to be working with a lot of people. So just in terms of submitting an expression of interest, you can see our website. It's just the Freshwater Improvement Fund and the MFE website. And so we encourage you to read the guide to the expression of interest before and as you're filling out the form. So that'll tell you everything that you need to know in terms of filling out the different sections. Make sure you stick to text limitations. The current form is locked, but the original version was unlocked. So if you happen to have downloaded an EOI a couple of weeks ago, please make sure that you're looking at what the text limitations are. You're also able to provide a 1 to 2 page cover letter. So if there's more that you want to say about the project that you weren't able to fit into the EOI, we're allowing you that opportunity to expand on it a little bit more in a cover letter. And we're also encouraging you to provide any letters of support from partners. So once you've filled out the expression of interest, just email it to fifapplication@mfe.gov.nz, and we will assess your expression of interest for eligibility. And all of that is outlined on our website. So just in terms of other opportunities, so all the Jobs for Nature agencies are aiming to be joined up in terms of our freshwater funding. So DOC and MPI and others will also have the opportunity to look at any expressions of interest that we received and be able to provide some feedback on those. And we can also have a look if there is a more appropriate funding source for a particular expression of interest. So even though you'll be applying to the Freshwater Improvement Fund, if your expression of interest isn't successful, it could possibly go to another more successful fund that's accepting expressions of interest or applications at the moment. So the other MFE funds that we have right now are Te Mana o Te Wai and DOC have just opened on the 14th of January 2 funds under the Restoring Nature stream for Jobs for Nature, which is the Community Conservation Fund and the Private Land Biodiversity Fund. And all the Jobs for Nature agencies are also still scoping various funding, and some of them are also targeted. So they might not have necessarily been released to the public, but your expression of interest might still fit in with one of those targeted funding streams. So it could still potentially go to that as well. So lots of opportunities. Just wanted to go through a couple of our successful projects, just so you can get an idea of the range of things that we've been funding recently under Jobs for Nature. So the first one is one by Horizons Regional Council, which is focused on fish passage. So that's quite a large project of 2.5 million over 5 years. And the project aims to provide a greater understanding of fish distribution and barriers to fish and the distribution of barriers across the rivers and streams in the region. And it's also going to remove at least 25 barriers to migration, which will open up a lot of kilometers of habitat to our native fish. I've just got a little video to show. So let's just see.
Cool, so today we've got our crew out with us, so we've got 9 new team members that have joined our Fish Passage team.
Through the Jobs for Nature project, a lot of our work is going to be walking streams to assess for barriers to fish migration.
So with culverts, dams, weirs, things like that, they tend to stop fish from being able to get to the ocean and back up again. So yeah, our job is to find those barriers and remediate them, because lots of our native fish species need to be able to get to the ocean and back up again to complete their life cycles. Usually up and downstream of these barriers we fish sample, so we gain abundance and biodiversity upstream and downstream of these barriers. We're able to measure them, weigh them, check the abundance, and then let them go on the merry way again.
One of the reasons for collecting that information too is that once we fix a whole lot of barriers, we can come back and do the same monitoring, and we can see what difference we've actually made to fish populations within the region. Jobs for Nature funding for us has been fundamental for this project. We definitely wouldn't have it on the scale that we currently have it on. So we have 9 team members that are on during the summer, whereas previously we might have had a quarter of an FTE dedicated to kind of doing this work. So it's a massive expansion without the Jobs for Nature funding.
I love my job because of where we're standing right now. I love being out in nature, not just sitting in the classroom talking about this stuff and talking about our native fish and things like that, but actually being out here helping them out, looking to remediate barriers for them, help them be able to get up and down streams and that sort of thing. So really actually making a difference here.
I grew up on a farm here in New Zealand, so yeah, it's really important to me to be spending time out in nature. It sings to my soul, I guess you'd say.
I love being outdoors. Came from the UK 15 years ago, and I just wanted to make a difference since a young age, so I feel like I'm really fulfilling that dream now.
It's really awesome to be working with a young group of people who are also super passionate about native fish and yeah, just bettering water quality in New Zealand.
All right. So that one was really focused on restoration of habitat and ecology, whereas this next one, the Bay of Plenty Bay Conservation Cadets, it's another large project. It's 3.5 million over 5 years. And this one is focused on employment and training. So to upskill the unemployed, underemployed, or redirecting careers with a focus on delivering conservation benefits. So this program is a 12-week training and work experience program, and it's run 3 times a year. And it's expected to create 150 FTE. And this is just a photo of the first 10 cadets as they begin on their mahi on the Monday, the 18th of January with Minister Parker there. And I also just wanted to showcase the West Coast project that was funded through the Public Waterway and Ecosystem Restoration, which was the Quick Start projects that the Jobs for Nature funding went to a couple of months ago. So this is a smaller project. It's 520,000 over 5 years, and it's growing eco-source native seeds at a nursery and planting those in local riparian areas with the community. So they've sown 20,000 seeds so far, and they're working with farmers and landowners to plant on their land. So that's all I wanted to go through there. So I'll stop and see if there are any questions that I can answer.
All right, thank you, Lauren. If you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A panel below. I do have a couple of questions for Lauren, and I'll get started on those. But again, feel free to pop those in below. You've got that Q&A bit. So Lauren, you mentioned a little bit already, the question being, what is a common theme for applications that fail? So you addressed it a little bit with specific points that people weren't making in the assessment criteria, but is there anything else that you would want to bring up about common themes for applications?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. So it's really around clarity. So some of the things that we noticed with round 2, where the application was successful, was a lack of clarity around the outputs of the project. So we're really looking for understanding what the project is going to achieve. So that could be such things as number of plants planted, or hectares of wetland restored, or number of people trained, and those kinds of things. So being really specific about what the output of the project is going to be. And now with the new focus on creating employment, we're really looking for clarity on job numbers and how the project will work to target the unemployed and partially employed in the region. So we're looking for some clarity around that, which some kind of failed on last time around. And then the final thing is really showcasing how you're going to engage with iwi and hapu and community groups, and how you're going to incorporate kind of their views and expertise in the participation in the project. So I mentioned before that there's a real strong focus on that kind of partnership and community engagement for this fund.
Cool. Actually, quite nicely following up, we've got a question from Sam saying, do you recommend prioritizing jobs in our application to local hapu or to people whose work has been affected by COVID? Is there a way you can kind of focus that in?
Yeah, so I think if you can focus in on that, that's ideal, because the purpose of the Jobs for Nature funding is to really target those that have lost their jobs because of COVID. So it's really a COVID recovery package. So seeing that extra focus on those that have lost their jobs due to COVID, and then also any working with iwi and hapu and increasing their capacity and capability, it would be something that we would like to see as well.
Cool. I have a question on legal entity status. So it seems to be a general requirement that having legal entity status is important when applying for funding. Why, as the funder, is that important for you? And then if there's a single individual landowner, is there a way they can still be involved or benefit?
Yeah, so I think a single person would be eligible to apply, but it's just if you have a group of people that want to apply for funding, but they don't have a legal entity to sit under, is where it gets problematic for us as funders. So it's really to kind of minimize our risk, because if you have a whole group of people that don't sit under one legal entity, then we'd either have to work with one person that would subcontract to others, or try to contract to a whole bunch of people, and that can just get messy and a bit risky for us as funders. So that's why we really need to make sure that we're contracting with a legal entity. And in terms of just a single landowner, since this is targeted at kind of big projects, we would really encourage you just to work with any community groups or charitable trusts, or approach your regional councils or other groups within your community with any project ideas that you might have, and see if you can work with others to get some funding for the work that you would like to do.
Excellent. I've got a couple more questions.
Mm-hmm.
From some of the other participants. Sam has asked, is there a good, average, or bad numbers for FTEs?
So what we are looking for is 1 FTE per $100,000 of Crown funding. So your project might have other funding sources, but as long as you've got 1 FTE per what you're going to get from the Freshwater Improvement Fund per $100,000, that's basically the minimum. Sure, we would like to see more than that, but as long as you're kind of meeting that minimum, we're pretty happy with that. So I wouldn't necessarily, there's kind of like say there's a good, bad, or average, but just, yeah, make sure you're meeting that minimum.
All right. We have another question on, does fencing wetlands and riparian areas count as restoration?
I would think so. I actually don't know if you have a formal definition of restoration, but I can get back to you on that.
Cool. Yeah, I look forward to that. Looking at that. A question on, again, that level of protection. So for areas that it is being restored, does the land need some sort of level of protection?
Yeah, it does. Yes, that's not my area of expertise, so I can't give you the details around that, but we want to make sure that our investment is protected. So if you're restoring certain areas, we would want to make sure that there is some kind of level of protection, and that, you know, as soon as the project is over, it's not going to go be developed or, you know, something along those lines.
Okay, I think that answers another person's question who has asked if a project incorporates different land designations, e.g. private, dock, river reserve, coastal regime, is there something required in terms of legal status of the land? And I think that's kind of what you already answered.
Yes, yeah, but sorry, I can't give kind of more details around that.
Thank
But
you for
if there is,
providing
I can come back to you on that though.
Okay. If you get back to me on that, I'll see what I can do to share it with everybody. Another question is, will there be future funding rounds in case these current funding opportunities are missed?
So this will probably be the last funding round for the Freshwater Improvement Fund. So it's probably going to be fully allocated up to the 100 million that we receive from the government. There is going to be more Jobs for Nature funding. So we've got MFE itself still has quite a lot of funds from Jobs for Nature that we haven't allocated yet. So there's going to be more coming up there. And then there's also a lot more funding through other government agencies. So while this is it for the Freshwater Improvement Fund, there's definitely going to be more funding available coming up.
All right. And looks like one more question about partnerships and overall kind of weighing on like what are some of the weighted priorities for applications, but specifically with relation to partnerships. When thinking about partnerships, how is it rated? Is it more partners are better, or the more partner funding, the better? What's the priority there?
It's kind of all of the above. And it's also not, we don't just want, a laundry list of, oh, these are all the people that, we've talked to. We want to see kind of meaningful partnerships. So what we would be looking for, so at the expression of interest stage, it might be a little bit different. Like if you have partners, that's, letters of support from partners, that's great, but we don't necessarily expect you to have that all laid out at this stage. By the application stage, we would like to see that. So it's not just who you intend to engage with, but we would like to understand how you're going to partner with them. So what are they going to be providing to the project? Whether it's in kind or being a member of your governance group or whatever it is. And then in terms of co-funding, we do expect to see a level of co-funding when we decide who's going to be successful. So we no longer have a minimum percentage of co-funding, which we did during round one. There's no minimum, but we also, if there was zero co-funding, that application, wouldn't have been successful. So we do encourage you to look for other avenues of funding, because that'll make your expression of interest and your subsequent application more attractive.
All right, thank you so much. I don't have any more questions in the question log. I didn't have any more questions on my end. So with that, thank you very much, Lauren, for joining us and giving us your insight on Freshwater Improvement Fund and kind of your awareness of other fundings. And do you have anything else for us?
Oh, that's it. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you. With that, I would like to turn it over to Nardene. Nardene is the Waikato Regional Coordinator, and she's been with the New Zealand Landcare Trust since 2003. She's been involved in many projects to help achieve more sustainable land management practices, restore native biodiversity, and promote the great work volunteer landcare groups are undertaking in the Waikato. Essentially, she knows what she's doing. It's pretty cool. And so I'd like to talk to her and ask her a couple of questions. And if you guys have questions for her as well, please, by all means, again, add them to the Q&A screen. But starting with, Nardene has successfully applied for some of the freshwater improvement funds. And so that's fantastic to hear. And I'll ask that as my first question. Nardene, what is some of your experience in applying for funding? What have been your successes, failures? What kind of scales are you looking at?
Because I've been doing this a while, I have experience in applying for very small funding bodies, $2,000 to $3,000 for pest control, bait and things like that, up to really large funding applications, and have had a number of successes and failures along the way with all of them. So I guess it's so yeah, that's you really have to know what the funder is looking for, and as Lauren mentioned, be clear in your objectives of what you can and can't achieve in your application.
Okay.
Whether it's big or small, yeah. So if it's a small application, you still have to be really clear, and in a bigger, and it gets harder as you get bigger. The difference is that often your reporting requirements are a lot larger for a bigger application than a smaller one.
Okay. From this perspective of a landowner, how have you in various funding applications, from the small $2,000 to $3,000 up to your freshwater improvement fund application, how do you include individual landowners?
Well, mostly landowners approach us, and that's the best way to work with landowners, is the ones that are really keen, who have projects that they've got thought about and want to make improvements on. And so working with the willing landowners is the absolute most important thing. If you've got a project that you think is a good project and you want to approach the landowners to see if they'd be interested, then you have to do that and say, we can't guarantee that we're going to get this funding, but if we get this funding, this is what we can do, and this is how we can help. But these are the things that you would need to put into the project as well, so that it's not a surprise if they are required to spend some time doing maintenance or put up a fence or whatever the thing is that is part of the landowner contribution. So yeah, you kind of, and I would steer away from trying to sell it to somebody unrealistically, and I also would steer away from trying to encourage somebody to get involved if they really don't want to get involved, because it's just going to be too much hard work and they might end up resenting being involved. So I would just work with the willing right at the beginning. And what I have found is that over time people go, oh, that looks quite good, what that person's doing over there, and asking to get involved that way, rather than trying to convince somebody at the beginning of the project when you haven't really had any runs on the board. But once you've got some runs on the board, then you can bring in the other people who might have been a little bit hesitant to start with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. And it kind of rolled into my next one, so you answered that pretty well. I do have a question from somebody. I think this might be a question for Lauren, so I might hold on to this one.
Sure.
I think it might be better suited for Lauren.
Cool.
So I will go back to asking you, can you tell me a little bit more about your experiences with collaboration when applying for funding? Why have you collaborated? Who have you collaborated with? And how and when do you involve iwi?
So collaboration is absolutely crucial, and Lauren did mention that. And it's I can't stress it enough really. What I think it shows to funders is that you have really thought about your project, you've thought about who needs to be involved, whether it's Fish and Game or DOC or whoever, and then you've approached those people and worked through the project together, and that you're all willing to work together for the betterment of the project. Because sometimes people are working together, but in silos sometimes. So being able to show that you are talking to other people and other organisations is really a good thing. I think, in a way, everybody that you can get involved in the project is important, and especially mana whenua. I think that's the most important. Go to the local marae, go to your local marae, find out who to talk to. If I know here in the Waikato Regional Council, they can help you connect to a local rep that you might be able to make an approach to find out who the best person to talk to is, and know that these people are hugely busy, and but they do appreciate being invited to hear about your project. So ask if you can go and speak on the marae about your project, and get that conversation going right from the beginning, as soon as you even think about it. I think that's the most important thing. And because timing is really tricky, and I see timeframes are quite short to get your expression of interest in, but you've got until June to get an application in. So you can have some time there to build that conversation and get some support. Mana whenua, I think, would just really like to be involved, so that they can be connected to their significant sites that some people might not even know about.
Okay, excellent. Are there any other top tricks, hints, do's, don'ts of applying for funding that you might be willing to share with farmers, individual landowners, other groups that are interested in applying for funding?
I guess don't be scared of the funding opportunity. Take that opportunity, because it sounds like it's not going to come around again, especially for the Freshwater Improvement Fund. I know there is some more funding out there, but have a punt, like you won't know unless you try, and then you can always go back and ask for hints on, if you don't get through, on how you can do better next time. And it sounds really great what Lauren was saying around going to that joined up process of seeing other funds that might be available, if it's not relevant or not most suited for the Freshwater Improvement Fund. But and really draw on support of your agencies, people like Rhianna, who's there to help you, if you to help collaborate, bring people together, find out who else is applying, so that you can share and pool resources. I think that's really important. You don't have to do everything by yourself. Working together is really the key. So that's some tricks, do's. Don't not tell it to people. Like, talk to people about it. Say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, so that to get their feel for it, to see what they think, because they might come up with an aspect that you hadn't thought of that could actually be a really great part of the project. So talk to people. Don't just be close thinking about it. I think is the important thing. Talk. Oh, I'm just repeating myself now, but those are the things that I can think of at the moment.
All right, thank you so much. I think that
trouble.
was helpful, and some good bits and tips and tricks here and there. Thank you, Nardene.
Pleasure.
Lauren, if you are still there, I had one more question for you. Do you mind?
Cool. Yeah.
Excellent. The other question was, does receiving funding through one government body make it less likely to receive funding through another? Does existing Jobs for Nature funding count as co-funding? And or if there are a specific project fund a funded group was looking at, would it be more likely to be successful if it is different in scope?
So
there's a lot on there.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding that right, so if a project got funding from one government agency, could it also get funding? Yes. I think what we would look to do in that case is either work with the other agency or to try to turn it into two different projects that are still kind of connected. I think in terms of the co-funding question, we'd also be looking for co-funding outside of just Crown sources. So we wouldn't want it to be 100% government funded. We would be expecting some funding from regional councils or other groups and things like that.
And then I think that answers the first part of it. If there was a specific project a funding group was looking at, it would be more likely to be successful if it is different in scope when looking for more additional funding.
Yeah, I'm trying to just make sure that I understand it completely correctly. So if it's already a funded project and you're just looking for additional money to continue the project, or I don't think it has to be different in scope. It would just have to have a clear component that you would be expecting the Freshwater Improvement Fund or MFE to fund. We wouldn't be expecting that it would just be duplicate of the application that you were already successful for. We would expect to know exactly what is the portion of it that you would need funding from us.
Cool. That makes sense. Thank you so much. All right. And with that, I want to take this a little bit more on a West Coast, bit more of a West Coast context. So I'm going to share my screen over here. All right. So again, funding environmental outcomes on your farm on the West Coast. A couple of things is, again, my name is Rhianna. I work with the New Zealand Landcare Trust, and our vision as the New Zealand Landcare Trust is as an independent, not-for-profit organization with a vision for clean and healthy waters, profitable farms, and connected communities, with a mission for sustainable land and water management through community engagement. So why are we looking at these environmental outcomes to start with? So what I want to think about is, sure, we do all have regulation and policy hanging over our heads, but when we're thinking about environmental outcomes, I might urge you to think maybe about addressing some of these environmental outcomes in a slightly different way with a slightly different approach. As farmers, landowners, a sharper tool equals greater results for less effort. Can we think potentially about sharpening nature as a tool and what it can and does do to help your farm instead of being maybe necessarily bogged down by some of the regulation and policy? So nature on your farm can help with productivity in the immediate as well as long term. Planting helps provide shelter for stock and habitat for bees, birds, and spiders. Better water quality is better for whitebait, trout, and waterfowl, depending on what your hobbies are. Predator control is beneficial as predators are pests on farms and negatively impact native animals. Now, New Zealand Landcare Trust thinks the catchment approach is a strong tool, and I'm with that. We think it's a really good, strong tool because land and water issues don't care about property boundaries. So I urge you in thinking about how to solve some of the environmental problems on your farm to consider the catchment approach. Because you want swimmable water at the river mouth, it could be a single point source, but it could also be a cumulative impact on multiple different locations up the farm, and therefore a catchment approach is important. You want to eliminate stoats in your surrounding bush. Sure, you can do it in your bush, but they disperse easily. So the larger the range that you can cover in eliminating these stoats and other pests, the more impact you're going to have on your range and more challenging it is for them to repopulate. Do you want good hunting and fishing? Both of those require diverse habitats, so contiguous, accessible waterways for fish, clean sheltered wetlands for waterfowl are important. So important to think about that catchment approach. And then I also think catchments are important and useful because catchments are easily scalable. You can think about them as big as the Buller River, but that's really daunting. A catchment can actually be quite small. So it can start from 2 to 3 to 4 landowners within a smaller stream or tributary, and then add that up over time into a larger range. The benefit of that scalability means that as landowners, you can set achievable, real, practical solutions, also known as action on the ground for you. So that's why catchment is an important thing to consider when considering environmental outcomes. And then also why the community approach. So again, New Zealand Landcare Trust's goal is to approach the work that we're doing from the community aspect. And that's because we know that you guys know your community best. It's yours, you know it best, your issues are locally relevant, all groups are different, all regions are different, and you have local intimate knowledge. Also, the community approach is inclusive of all landowners. It is landowners, farmers, beef, sheep, dairy, agriculture, lifestyle, what have you, forestry, iwi. A catchment group involves local people dealing with local issues or sharing knowledge and resources, learning new things, and the social aspects of catchment care and that catchment community are just as important as the end goal and your final product. And then ultimately, as a community, you determine your desired outcomes. Is your desired outcome within your community profitability? Is it sustainability? Is it addressing policy concerns? You decide. It could be other interests entirely, but again, as a community, you determine what your outcomes are. All right, I did promise I would discuss funding in a West Coast context and with some specific funding in mind, in addition to what Lauren had shared with the Freshwater Improvement Fund and Jobs for Nature. So there is a huge range of funding available, and fortunately for all of us, there's not enough time to bore you with all of it because there's just a lot of it. But I do want to go through some of it. I'm not an expert on some of these funds that I'm going to share with you by any means, but I have tried to spend some time to break it down and help it be a little more skimmable for landowners and farmers interested in funding these environmental outcomes. Any project that you're interested in is going to require additional work to see if it might suit your goals, but that's something that I can help with. So as Nardene had said before, if you're interested in a project, that's how some of these projects go ahead. Somebody has an idea, has a spark, and I can do what I can to help match you with collaborators, partners, other interested bodies that have similar goals and objectives, and therefore figure out how to frame a project. Unfortunately, in the research that I found, there is limited that is specifically West Coast focused, but these are a few tasters of national level projects and a little bit of West Coast stuff. So I'm going to go through just a couple of them real quick here. You can see how a little bit I've structured what I've been trying to do in my research. So one example of funding is a Sustainable Food and Fibers Future, their general fund. This is funded through MPI. The goal of this fund is to generate innovation towards New Zealand's food and fiber sectors. What they want to see with this funding is something new, something inspiring within a community. It is a reasonable amount of paperwork to pursue this particular project, depending on the scale. And the objective is also sustainable benefits. So in thinking about this project, an important aspect of this project would be thinking about the extension of it. How do you want to share what you do, what you're learning about going forward? But if you can see in this breakdown here, land tenure is private. The applicants for this would be an established community group or larger. So if you were in a catchment group and you had a catchment scale project, it might be possible to pursue at this level, but it's not something that is particularly accessible for individual landowners. Partnership and collaboration, as we discussed earlier, is recommended in this funding, but not required. The funding opportunity is one that is ongoing. So it's happening on the regular. You could put an application in now, you could put one in 3 months. Monetary range, they have a wide monetary range, but these are the two smaller, more accessible ones, the small grant and the grant. And as a landowner, it would require cash or in-kind investment at a minimum of 20%, but closer to 40 or 50%. So just a little bit on that one. Another one is the New Zealand Game Bird Habitat Trust. You'll notice a difference on this one. It's private landowners, but the applicants can be individuals or an organization as opposed to requiring a catchment group approach. It's an annual fund closing June 30th. Monetary range isn't particularly specified, but really cool interest in pursuing the development and enhancement of habitat for the benefit of game birds and other wetland inhabitants. If you have a funding idea and you're interested, this is one that I could match you up with it, but would then send you over to Fish and Game and help you work with Fish and Game a bit more on developing and enhancing your area for game birds and other wetlands. More local is the Community Care Fund. So TransPower has assets running through the Grey and Buller Valleys. So TransPower, with having those assets, does fund some community-based projects, including those with an environmental focus. With that, as a community group, you'll notice on here GST status is not required, but community focus is important for applying for the Community Care Fund. So land isn't specified. You don't have to have GST status for this, but the focus of it is community-based projects. The TransPower is looking to engage a high level of community benefit and engagement. So that would be the different take you'd have to look at in applying for this relatively small scale funding, 5,000 to 50,000 if you would like. So it wouldn't benefit an individual farm per se, unless you can figure out how to consider its community involvement and community impact, but is one that is very specifically focused because of TransPower's impact on the Grey and Buller Valleys. Other forms of funding that I found in my discoveries and research that is quite interesting and quite cool is the Trees That Count. So Trees That Count program brings together businesses, community, and individuals to help plant native trees. With this scheme, an individual landowner is eligible. So an individual landowner would be responsible for planting a minimum number of trees on their own. Once those minimum number of trees have been planted, they are then eligible to apply for funding in a bit of a co-funding pursuit, generally about 50-50, apply for a number of trees, and then there are funders who are interested in helping fund native plants in New Zealand. So if that's something that's of interest for you, you're already in the realm of purchasing or of planting trees, this might be a project to look at to get some support in funding some of the trees that you're planting. Another program is the Million Meter Streams project. This is a crowdfunding platform pairing landowners and field partners with funders. So because we only have so much time, I'm going to leave it at that for funding options. As mentioned, though, this is just a taster. I will share my breakdown of funding with anyone interested, and it will be available on the New Zealand Landcare Trust webpage. In terms of thinking on the bigger scale, what Lauren had to share was really insightful, really helpful, but for the West Coast, we need to figure out how to break it down a little bit more. I will admit I'm not an ideas person. This is where you as a landowner or your organization knows your area best, but just a couple of possibilities that I've heard bandied around already. From large scale would be a large scale pest management up the Taramacau River. So that would be a project that could look at the Community Conservation Fund, looking at a large-scale pest management project up the Taramacau, and in order to achieve the minimum Community Conservation Fund funding, it would fund a project coordinator, probably trappers as contractors. It would be supplies for traps, community events, etc., in order to achieve the minimum Community Conservation Fund. And it would be supported by, most likely supported by a couple of one or a couple smaller scale community organizations, and then looking at some more collaboration as and where possible to make the most strong application possible. Just a possible idea there. Another one is swimmable waterways in Westport. So within the Freshwater Improvement Fund that Lauren was talking about, there is an identified area within Westport that has poor long-term water quality trends and isn't recommended for swimming at times due to high E. coli levels. So in order to pursue the Freshwater Improvement Fund, it would be possible in this area, but it would have to be a big scale thinking and would likely need to include a catchment coordinator, project coordinator, contractors for planting, fencing, weeding, potentially looking at bridging waterways as is able within the funding requirements, and then looking at farm environment plans, because that does fit within the Freshwater improvement funds is the potential for looking at some farm environment plans. So that would be a way to make quite a large scale project in an area. But on the smaller scale, that exists too. Constructed wetlands for effluent management, that could be a project with the sustainable farming futures. And then that small scale individual stream planting projects would be within that Trees That Count program. Okay, that's all I got on there at the moment. Where to from here? If you are a landowner, a organizer, somebody who has ideas, let me know. Let's discuss how and who else we can make it happen. Who can help support, who would be the collaborators, who would be the contractors that would actually be on the ground working to make your project happen when and if funding occurs. And I would urge you to move quickly because some of these amazing Jobs for Nature funding opportunities, as we have already heard, aren't going to be around forever. If you think a catchment group might be the right thing for you, as was mentioned earlier, in terms of working and collaborating within the community, get in touch and I can help you assist in that process. From finding that, from facilitating and determining your structure to determining what status you might like based on what you're interested in. Generally, groups have more access to a wider range of advice, financial support, and therefore they make it more effective than an individual at various times in work an individual working alone. So consider whether a catchment group might be the right thing for you to help you pursue your environmental outcomes. And finally, if you're not sure yet, that's okay. Check out the landcare.org.nz for a little bit more about what we do and how we help. And you can check the West Coast New Zealand Landcare Trust Facebook page for updates on events, resources, funding, and more. Again, I will be sure to share what information I have. This webinar is being recorded and will be saved and shared in a couple of places. So if you know somebody who hasn't been able to attend, if you want to go back in on something to double check it, check your answers, or otherwise get in contact with somebody, you can pursue it there. All right. Thank you guys very much. Are there any last questions before we end the webinar? All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Hopefully you found got some good information out of it, found maybe or sparked it for an idea for a project. Hopefully Lauren answered some questions. Nardene had some good insight. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to reach out. And I look forward to maybe seeing if we can get some more funding on the West Coast. Thank you so much.